Good evening, everyone. Let us get started. Good evening. Please do take your seats. I'm delighted to see what a wonderful turnout we have. I am Peter Manuelian. I'm standing in for Caroline Fernald, Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, who couldn't be with us tonight. HMSC's mission, as you all know, is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. So I'm delighted to welcome our in-person as well as our Zoom audience tonight to the lecture co-sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East and the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. To learn more about upcoming museum events, I invite you to visit our website, hmsc.harvard.edu. We have several educational and fun program opportunities for adults, teens, and children. And now on to tonight's presentation. Most of you have heard of our own George Reisner, who ran the Harvard MFA expedition at Giza and elsewhere along the Nile for 4 decades plus. Well, tonight I think we have the only archaeologist who has outlasted Reisner himself at Giza. Born and raised in North Dakota, Dr. Mark Lehner first came to Egypt in 1973, where he received his BA in anthropology at the American University in Cairo. He lived in Egypt for 13 years, working for American, Egyptian, British, French, and German archaeological projects. From 79 to 83, he was field director and then director of the Sphinx project, sponsored by the American Research Center in Egypt. He later returned to the US, where he received his PhD in Egyptology in 1990 from Yale University. Mark is now director and president of Ancient Egypt Research Associates, or AERA, an organization he founded in 1985 with Matthew Macaulay. Matthew is with us tonight. Delighted to have him with us. His 40 years of archaeological research in Egypt include mapping the Great Sphinx and discovering a major part of the lost city of the pyramids at Giza. He directs the Giza Plateau Mapping Project, or GPMP, which conducts annual excavations of Old Kingdom settlements at the site with an interdisciplinary and international team of archaeologists, geochronologists, botanists, and faunal specialists. From 1990 to 95, he was assistant professor of Egyptian archaeology at the University of Chicago. He's now an associate at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at Chicago, formerly the Oriental Institute. Mark is author of a host of articles, newsletters, and annual reports that are way too numerous to mention. For monographs, however, I'll mention a few. He has published The Complete Pyramids in 1997, the truly monumental Giza and the Pyramids, The Definitive History, with Zahi Hawass in 2017, and most recently, The Red Sea Scrolls, definitely one of the best book titles I've come across in a long time. The Red Sea Scrolls, How Ancient Papyri Reveal the Secrets of the Pyramids, with Pierre Tallet in 2022. He has appeared on television for National Geographic, for Nova, and many other public television documentary series. Tonight, we are very lucky to see how modern approaches to older excavations can reveal critical new information. Please welcome Mark Lehner to speak on rediscovering sculptures of King Menkaure at the Giza Pyramids. Mark.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me all right with the 2 mics and the sound? So it's really good to be here. A little bit under duress. I'm going to end up doing what they say you should never do in a lecture. Actually, I'm going to do 3 things they say you should never do in a lecture if you want to be effective in communicating. But I'll do those later. What I'd like to say right now is why it's meaningful is that this year I realized reading Peter Manuelian's amazing biography of George Reisner that my God, this is my 47th year of active archaeological fieldwork on the Giza Plateau. And Reisner worked 42 years, 1902 to 1942, when he passed at about my age. And so I have outlasted Reisner. The thing is, Reisner has accomplished so much more than any archaeologist today, self-included, could hope to do. And I'm talking about, the length of my experience, not to toot my own horn, because at this age I feel tooted enough, but to set a certain context for the talk tonight. Reisner, focused primarily on the cemeteries at Giza, and a lot of Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology is very focused on the ancient Egyptians' tombs, where people died, where they were buried. And my archaeology has been very different. It's kind of focused on the settlement where people lived, and I would much rather be talking tonight, frankly, about the lost city of the pyramids, which is not too hyperbolic, or the Sphinx, because those are very comfortable lectures, and the one tonight is not comfortable. We have amassed Ancient Egypt Research Associates in our own center and villa. About 1 city block from the entrance to the Giza Plateau, we have amassed a data set, information probably as big data, as the information garnered from all of Reisner's years. It's different kind of data. It's not tombs and architecture and statuary and inscriptions, all of which are hugely important. Believe me, I'm all for joining art history and text and archaeology. Otherwise, we're handicapping ourselves if we don't synthesize all those kinds of information. But our data is about what people were eating, animal bone, plant remains, a lot of mud brick architecture. And so it's a very different data set than what Reisner amassed and what is held at the Museum of Fine Arts, and thanks to Peter Dermanuelian here at the Harvard Giza Archives Project. Where we overlap, Reisner and I, is on the Menkaure Valley Temple. And so I went to the Menkaure Valley Temple for reasons I'll talk about, because it's a settlement. It was part of the greater urban context of the ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids, as was our lost city of the pyramids, just a stone's throw away. And so I really took Reisner up on his invitation when he wrote in his diary, not his publication, his diary, he said, "With regret, I have determined to cover up all the back or western part of the temple, the Menkaure Valley Temple. Perhaps in another century, some archaeologists may wish to test the accuracy of our work or to settle questions which may come up later." And so I took him up on that challenge 111 years later, and now it's 114 years later. So I'm not sure that was a wise decision, because Reisner worked at the Menkaure Valley Temple for 5 months total, maybe 6. We've been working there for 9 seasons in a total of about 18 months. It's a hugely complicated place because it's not just settlement, it's primarily architecture. It's a temple, not too much bigger in area than this auditorium, maybe a little bit more, maybe twice the auditorium in area. And it was occupied for 301 years, the entire span of the Old Kingdom from Menkaure to the last king of the Old Kingdom, Pepi II. And it's just very complicated. And so I'm going to tell you now, I don't understand, I don't fully comprehend what I'm presenting, this content. And what I'm going to present is actually an exercise of some of the complexities and some of what we've learned and some of the broad stroke understandings that do change understandings that have been on the books to date. But believe me, this for me is an exercise in understanding for my own sake, putting this lecture together. We came back from Egypt only about 48 hours ago, and so I started putting a lecture together that is really totally intractable, too late. And so about 45 minutes ago, I was still frantically trying to wrap it up and tie it off. So that's what you should not do if you want to give a good lecture, like a TED Talk. Don't apologize. But I'm just being honest. I have to say some thank you. First to Dr. Walter Gilbert, Wally, who's with us here tonight. And I don't need to give Wally's bona fides, but Wally has made possible our reinvestigation of the Menkaure Valley Temple. And the other is Dr. Florence Friedman, who is an invaluable team member and who handles the statuary. And you're going to see in a second that I'm altering the title a little bit, because the title on the poster as it stands is really a Florence talk. Florence owns the Menkaure sculptures, that topic. And I'll get back to that a little bit more in just a second. I also want to thank Charles Simonyi, who happens to be here in his cosmonaut suit. He went up with Russian cosmonauts. Charles developed the Microsoft Office package at Microsoft, and he and Microsoft are really keeping us going with unrestricted support, which is so important. Lee and Ramona Bass out of Texas, Fort Worth, Luis and Howard Van Stiel, and then many other major donors who have made AERA's work possible and continue to do so. And a lot of members of AERA, and all of you can join and take out a basic membership. It all helps. So I also want to thank Dr. Peter DeManuelian, because as complex as this topic is, and you're going to see me getting into trouble here and kind of maintaining coherence, maybe I can maintain some coherence. Without Peter's work, we wouldn't be able to do this at all. And I'm speaking of Peter being the driving force behind the Giza Archives project at the Museum of Fine Arts, and then its transfer here to Harvard University. Believe me, that is an invaluable tool. This is Peter when he was visiting us in 2011. When Wally and Florence visited us in 2019, and we would spend hours after the site work going through the Harvard Giza archives, poring over every little clue in those old photographs of Reisner and the notes and so on. So thank you, Peter, for doing that. It's an invaluable yeoman's work. I also want to thank Dan Jones. Dan Jones doesn't like to be called field director, but that's really what he is. He's our senior archaeologist. Everything we do in AERA, we do according to the Museum of London Archaeological Service, MOLAS, standards, and it's a very meticulous kind of archaeology recording, and that's what we're applying at the Menkaure Valley Temple. Dan is a master of this meticulous, best standard practice. He really runs everything on site, and a lot of the insights I'm going to present tonight are really those of Dan. He's probably the best hands-on archaeologist I've ever worked with. I want to thank Syed Salah. He's our overseer of workers, what they call a rais, but he's much more than that. He's a skilled, gifted excavator, and he's really our secret weapon. I want to thank Rebecca Miracle. She's our GIS person out of Austin, also coming to be with us on site. Sorry, Rebecca, I was last minute. I only had your passport photo. Dan will send Rebecca hordes of data taken with a survey total station survey instrument or laser scanning, and she shoots it back, sometimes because of the time change, by the time we wake up in these beautiful maps, some of which you might see. Well, it was the late 19th century AD. Let's see how this goes. And the real thing I'm worried about is timing, because usually this is what you're not supposed to do. Usually I have my lectures well timed, but let's see how this goes. It was a dark storm. No, it was the late 19th century AD. Egyptologists had just begun to recognize that pyramids not only included temples at their base, but also long causeways connecting to a temple in the valley, a place Egyptians associated with Hathor, these valley temples of pyramids. Hathor was the mother of the king as Horus, and mother goddess for all. See, this is the other thing you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to put a lot of text and then read. But I'm going to try to keep it short and caption-like. But just, I understand. You know, I've read the recommendations. But so Menkaure's Valley Temple is bound to what might be the largest tomb of a queen mother, which I find very interesting because his valley temple is down there in this area that they associated with Hathor, the mother goddess, the goddess of love. There were actually down near the valley temples, Egyptologists know this from texts, there were love shrines, merit shrines, associated with Hathor. They're not quite sure where these love shrines are. Some think they are the valley temples. But this whole area we're talking about was associated with Hathor, the goddess of love, the mother goddess. So Menkaure's Valley Temple is right next to this queen mother. Okay, that's why I'm jiggering the title a little bit, Rediscovering the Context of King Menkaure's Sculptures at the Giza Pyramids. Because again, I would not I would never get up here without fainting and talk about these sculptures in front of Florence Friedman. So I'm talking about everything around the sculptures and how they were found. This Queen Mother, by the way, of this dyad that's over there in the Museum of Fine Arts, I don't know how well you can see it here. We'll take another closer look a little later. Nobody knows who it is. Even the fact that it's a mother and not the queen, not the consort or wife of the king, is a matter of debate, but it's pretty much accepted by Dr. Florence Friedman, by Dorothea Arnold at the Metropolitan Museum, who commented on this, that this is a mother, not a wife. But who is it? Just like Menkaure's Valley Temple and his whole pyramid complex, they never quite finished this sculpture. Go look at it at the MFA. It's just beautiful. It's magnificent. It was the centerpiece for a blockbuster exhibit at the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1999. There it stood after a whole hall gallery of fantastic sculpture and works of art from the Old Kingdom. And there was the dyad, spotlit, polished floors, just an amazing piece of work. And yet, they didn't quite finish the bottom there on the feet, sanding it, polishing it, and so they didn't etch the titles. Where they did on other sculptures, as we'll see, they etched the name of the king, his epithets, and they etched the name of Hathor, for example, but they didn't give her name, and and so we're at a loss for exactly who she is. But I think I know who she is, and you can probably already hint where this is going. So the site, does this really work, this newfangled? I still like the old carousels with slides. Let's see, the site, yeah, about there, is where the Menkaure Valley Temple is. It's just on the edge of this wadi. A wadi is like an arroyo, a valley, that cuts through the Giza Plateau and separates the Pyramid Plateau proper, which is called the Mokattam Formation, from another formation to the south called the Mahdi Formation. It's just not in a very good location. It's subject to flash flooding, just on the shoulder of this wadi. Well, so just to give you some context, here's the Pyramid of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. Here's Khentkawes I, the tomb of this Queen Mother. There's the Sphinx beyond there. And of course, this slide was taken before any excavations had started to find the Menkaure Valley Temple. On January 27th, 1903, George Reisner, who must have been about 36 years old, made a very smart choice. Now, I don't know if he's 36 years old in this drawing. I don't even know where the drawing's from. I found it in my archives. Peter, we'll talk about it later. What was this smart choice? Well, the head of all of Egypt's antiquities, Glaston Maspero, said, we need to divide up this great Giza necropolis because it needs to be excavated, because the excavations that are happening are not very good. Illicit digging is going on. So Reisner had already established a name for himself and a reputation excavating in Upper Egypt before he came to Giza. But he had his sights on Giza. And when Maspero said, come up to Cairo and join Ludwig Borchardt for the Germans at that time, and Ernest Schiaparelli, and we'll divide this up so that you can excavate part, the Italians can excavate part, the Germans can excavate part. And so Reisner sent Arthur Mace to reconnoiter these pyramid complexes. After dividing up the big cemeteries, especially the one west of the Great Pyramid and east, then there were the pyramid complexes themselves. Arthur Mace very adroitly said, I actually think the most profitable site will be the third pyramid complex, even though you couldn't see anything. You had, the Great Pyramid standing and not much of its temple or its causeway to be seen, but the second pyramid, you had the Sphinx associated with it, and already what was called the Temple of the Sphinx, the Valley Temple of Khafre. So Schiaparelli actually thought Reisner's getting the short end of the stick by getting the third pyramid complex, and so he gave him part of his concession in the cemetery, but Reisner was perfectly happy to have this because Arthur Mace had told him, this is going to be very rich because it's buried. Nobody's seeing it. And so it was on July 10th, 1908, that they began cutting the sandy cover of the wadi. And within 3 days of cutting the sandy cover, They found 4 triads of Menkaure with Hathor and a gnome deity, and these were inscribed, so we know much more about them. So you can see them here. Now, I want you all to pay very careful attention. Look at that big crater. It's a newfangled pointer. It looks, like something on the moon. Pay attention to that crater. It's very important. This was an amazing find. Within 3 days, so it had actually been a month since they started looking for the Valley Temple. They did trenches. They knew they should follow the causeway, and they started something like June 27th. So they'd been working a month, but within 3 days of actually finding the spot, boom, they get these 3 triads, 2 of which are over in the Museum of Fine Arts and 2 others are in Cairo. Amazing pieces of sculpture for a whole lot of reasons. And Florence can give you a lecture and tell you those reasons. I'll just mention one. Here they were, right where somebody had stashed them in a corridor 4,400 years ago, no doubt about that. They weren't like in a hole where people were robbing them or something or tossed outside the temple. No, somebody left them there. Somehow they got buried, and here they were for Reisner and his team to find. So that's looking north, and that's looking south in this corridor where these triads were stashed. Now, these triads are not only just beautiful pieces of art, as you can see over in the Museum of Fine Arts, they're a record of temple economy, as well as important pieces of art history. And I think this is so cool that I just want to mention it. Florence has actually pointed out to all of us, to the Egyptological community, this is a record of nomes. A nome is like Massachusetts, North Dakota. This is a record of the nomes, the districts, the states that actually fed the builders, nomes with Hathor temples that fed the builders and staff of Menkaure's pyramid temples. We know this from Florence's work. So, one major article and 2 that are important for this, but her work was confirmed by the Wadi el-Jarf papyri, which is the most important discovery in my 50 years in archaeology. These papyri about which we wrote in the Red Sea Scrolls. Actual records of builders who are bringing stone for building the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And they've been published. It's a whole diary of one of these team leaders. What has not been so well published yet are the accounts of what these pyramid builders were getting. But what my colleague, Pierre Tallet, has written shows that the different nomes were in rotation, in his case in the Delta, sending goods, cattle, grain to feed this big building project. Florence had already determined that from her analysis of these triads, especially in the case of the triads that are known. And there are more triads known than just these 4, but they're broken, and I'm not going to deal. But these attest to nomes from Upper Egypt feeding the pyramid complex. Now, here's where I want to get into things that we're wrestling with, and that maybe our colleagues are not quite so well aware of. It's generally thought that that famous dyad was found in a big thieves' hole, as Reisner called it. He also called it an Arab treasure hunter's kind of hole, and one of several such big holes in the Menkaure Valley Temple site. And in fact, this is Thieves' Hole, as he called it, right up here, that big crater. That's why I wanted you to pay attention to it. This will be on the exam on next Wednesday. So, and that's why it's so important that we're looking north, and that's one set of triads, and here we're looking south. Now you see this big hole here, this crater has this revetment right there. Somebody actually lined up stone to hold the debris back, and so it wouldn't slide into this hole. The stony revetment of Thieves' Hole was built over debris filling corridor 4. That's the number that Reisner gets. So you see all that debris right there filling the corridor? And it's actually underneath the revetment that's holding up Thieves' Hole. So why is that important? There's Thieves' Hole looking in that direction. And you see this is the revetment here. So this is, it gets complicated. So here's the revetment looking in this direction of Thieves' Hole, and looking the other direction, there's the revetment there. Why is this important? because Reisner in his publication in 1931 said the dyad was found in Thieves' Hole, but Thieves' Hole's already been found and the dyad has not yet been found. And Reisner knew this in his diary, but because he published his report 22 years later, he conflated the hole where the dyad really was found with Thieves' Hole. And that makes a difference for the context of the dyad. Now, what you just saw was all seen in 1908. After stopping MVT work on July 25, 1908 for work in Palestine and Nubia and leaving the MVT site exposed for 16 months, ouch, Reisner returned his forces to resume work December 3, 1909, and he did this sketch. Now, what he's got here in this sketch is the causeway coming in here to the back of the temple. Here's the inner sanctuary, the offering hall, and the portico. And this is all he knows of it so far. This is all he knows of the Menkaure Valley Temple. And he's got these strips. This is all from his diary. Strip 1 is where they were working in 1908, strip 2, and then there's strip 3. And after expanding the old excavation, strip 1, they also started at the southwest corner of the temple, which is strip 4 outside of the sketch, and in the northwest, strip 5. You don't need to read this stuff down here. It will not be on the exam. But it's from his diary, this sketch. And here's the thing. They had already found Thieves' Hole in the summer 1908, though he doesn't show it in this December 16th, 1909 diary sketch. And so that's my attempt to show Thieves' Hole with the revetment around it. Now, the triads had already been found in 1908, and they were right there. They were right on the edge of Thieves' Hole, which is why I said pay attention to that big crater looking south. As they dug down underneath the Thieves' Hole revetment, a pair of heads appeared, January 18th. That pair of heads was the dyad. It was hiding under the revetment. It was in an older hole. So here it is. This is a very famous photo, much published, of the dyads first appearing. And then here they are fully exposed against a big limestone block. We call these core blocks because Menkaure wanted to start his temple with huge limestone blocks, like the temple of Khafre just to the northeast, the Khafre builder of the second pyramid. He didn't finish but a third of the temple in these giant limestone blocks, and so the temple was finished quickly in mud brick, we think by Menkaure's successor. But the dyad is standing upright, which is remarkable. It's facing east, and it's propped up against one of these huge core blocks that Menkaure's forces had laid as the temple foundation. During the time of the temple, someone carefully set the dyad into this hole, dug deep into the quarry debris, forming the temple foundation, standing upright, facing east against this big core block. Now, and you see this is the underside of that revetment of Thieves' Hole. So Thieves' Hole, the revetment was built over debris of the corridor that buried the older dyad hole, which you see here. We can identify this core block very nicely because of this, what I call a tethering post. And what is it? And we have gone back there, and as I'll show you, if we can move along in the lecture. So what we really have here is a tale of two holes. Now that is a fairly long text there, but basically Reisner realized he was dealing with two holes at the time he was excavating, because he wrote accordingly on January 16th, the last day of work before his team found the dyad on the late afternoon of January the 18th, being a day of rest. He wrote in his diary, next to Thieves' Hole in the room of slate triads, open 1908 equals corridor 4, there's another hole filled with such debris, yellow gravel, that must also be a Thieves' Hole. This is now being cleared. That's January 17th, the next day they found the dyad in that hole. It's an older hole, and you can actually see here in 1908 how they almost found it, because they're digging just underneath that revetment. They were probably very close to it, but it was not until 1910 that they actually found it. And this is the older hole. In general, Reisner knew from his excavations. Actually, he knew already in 1908, and that's why he's so perceptive. He already knew that he was dealing with two temples. And the plan on the left is the standard template that we all rely upon. Menkaure started a stone MVT with limestone monoliths. Shepseskaf completed his successor, the MVT in mud brick. And then in the 5th dynasty, this is all from Reisner, a flash flood destroyed the MVT. And Pepi II, the last king, the last major king of the Old Kingdom, Dynasty 6, rebuilt the MVT in mud brick. Now on the right, everything in green is the Shepseskaf, what Reisner called the first temple. Everything in orange is what Reisner called the second temple. Everything in green is Dynasty 4, Shepseskaf. Everything in orange is Dynasty 6, we think Pepi II. And then what you have going on here in the court is just a mess of walls and bins and granaries. People are living in that court. That's why I wanted to go back and work there, because it's a settlement. It's part of the urban history. And here you see these billowy lines around the temple. That's what we call Reisner's LOE, because in our archaeology we have our own acronym, limit of excavation. The plan was actually done, I believe, by Clarence Fisher. And you see, they were very tight within the confines of the Menkaure Valley Temple itself. And to go back to Thieves' Hole and Dyad Hole, by 1931, when Reisner published his report, his book, his final report, he had, now the two holes were connected. He'd taken out the revetment, connected Thieves' Hole and the older lower Dyad Hole, and he's just calling it Thieves' Hole, and that's where they found the Dyad. So this narrative developed that Arab treasure hunters were robbing the Dyad out of the hole, and they somehow left it, and for Reisner to find in 1910. But it looks like somebody very carefully put the Dyad there in ancient times. And I've tried to render in here on Reisner's plan, the revetment and the core blocks that are so important there. Here's this warren, this settlement within the court. My God, it's any archaeologist's nightmare, unless you're Reisner and nobody's excavated something like this before. Again, 5 months. It would take us years to excavate that, the way we give every single jot and tittle, a number. But one interesting thing here is, as Reisner moved east into a court crowded with houses, bins, and granaries, he backfilled the western third of the temple. So you can see there, that's what he said in that opening quote. I decided to backfill the temple. Nobody has seen the temple all at once, all together. And what did I do? I just pushed the wrong button. Oh, okay. So you see he's going down through silty settlement, debris, and piling it to the west. Then he's moving over and he's starting down through clean sand and he piles it to the west, burying the whole western part of the temple where he found the statues in those magazines. This is not really a chaos in the court, though, and even I have published something to that effect, calling this a sacred slum. There's really kind of an order to it. There are 3 different periods of settlement, and the middle settlement is actually the most organized, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But basically, you have rectilinear apartments to the south of the court, and you have bins and silos to the north. So you have like these people living or rotating through, like the movie Apartment, or what? But people are kind of living in an organized way, or staying overnight in the south part of the court, and all these bins and granaries are collecting grain, probably in the north. So, order in the court. If you go back, the very dark walls in Reisner and Clarence Fisher's map are the very first houses, which we don't know very well because they were destroyed by building later houses. And if we get rid of those earlier houses, this is the most organized settlement, and there's no doubt it's 5th dynasty. Dan Jones is actually going to give a paper at an Egyptology conference called Abu Sir and Saqqara in the year 2025 in Prague this coming summer, and it's going to be titled A 5th Dynasty Temple at Giza. everything you're seeing, most of what you're seeing is Dynasty 5, the 5th dynasty, the dynasty that followed Menkaure and Shepsiskaf. So we know this from just one broad clue is that 5th dynasty pottery, a complete vessel set was found underneath one of the rooms of these houses in the southern court. 5 apartments could relate to the 5 philes, which Pierre Tallet and I wrote about in Red Sea Scrolls. The philes, the za in ancient Egyptian, are these units of workers, temple staff, generally tend to be about 40, a half phyle is 20, and they came in sets of 5. So, but that's a different talk. The temple was turned on by Shepsiskaf. There's almost no doubt about that because Reisner found this decree in the upper temple, the pyramid temple, in fragments. You put them all together, and it seems to be a decree establishing pecher offerings, which sounds strange to the layperson, pecher offerings, but they're actually circulatory offerings or reversion offerings that come in and then they go out to temple staff and so on to support the temple. Shepsiskaf left a decree initiating this for the Sejmu, which Victoria Almanzavia Toro, who's here with us tonight, has established could be the dwellers within Shepsiskaf's temple. And then this was found in the upper temple. In the valley temple itself, you actually had a decree of Pepi II reestablishing, apparently, the services in the Menkaure Valley Temple. So you see it goes nicely with the 2 phases. So Shepsiskaf, green, Pepi, orange, and you actually have this link to the text. No one has ever seen the temple in phase altogether. Clarence Fisher pulled it all together in a multi-phase post-X map. So it's like it's like glass, you know, like there's no background, and you're seeing all the different phases of 300 years at once. And the billowy lines all indicate the LOE, the limit of excavation, as I've already said, and you have the link to these decrees, which I've already said. So it all worked out rather neatly. And this was our major understanding of the Menkaure Valley Temple. And this major publication, which is still extraordinarily useful, 21 years after Reisner's MVT excavations, his final publication appeared when he was 64, I guess. I don't know that he's 64 in that photo. Peter would know, but it's just, he looks old like I do, so I used that photo. And this is then our basic template. But what we're finding is that much of this is a 5th dynasty temple. And there are different parts that Reisner already knew were 5th dynasty. For example, he acknowledged that, this wall here is 5th dynasty. The limestone walkway is 5th dynasty. They had redone the magazines. He recognized a lot of 5th dynasty elements, but he didn't see it as a major phase. In fact, we think that much of this is 5th dynasty, and I'll try to explain. Now, things got really confusing when Salim Hassan excavated a major part of the MVT 22 years after Reisner stopped his work in the MVT. What? Salim Hassan, who's here, and thank you, Peter, for this photo. It's an amazing photo of Salim Hassan over here, standing in the vestibule of the temple. Sorry. See how high the walls are? Keep that in mind when you see what they... So unlike Reisner, Salim Hassan did not backfill. Unlike Reisner, Salim Hassan did not record very systematically. And we already have a very complicated situation with 301 years of people living, building, rebuilding, and so on. And then Salim Hassan excavates a major part of the MVT, but doesn't backfill. So when we came to work there in 2008, a lot of it is eroded away. That complicates things because we don't have what filled the spaces anymore. We don't have the stratigraphy. What do major part of the MVT? He didn't actually go back inside the MVT that we've been looking at. No. 1 year after Reisner's Mycerinus in 1932, Salim Hassan excavated the Khentkawes town, moving from east to west. So started at the eastern end, and then he moves towards this huge monumental tomb. By the way, this is the best that AI can correct a photo cribbed, from one of Salim Hassan's rather poor quality. So AI is not, it still has a ways to go to make it perfect. Yeah, Salim Hassan moved from east to west towards the tomb of this Queen Mother, and we know that her complex is tightly adjoined to Menkaure's, what I call, Valley Hathor Mother Zone. There's Khentkawes. The door jambs of her chapel give her titles. Now, when he finished this part of the Khentkawes town, which we call the northern leg of the town turns, he went that way towards the MVT, the Menkaure Valley Temple. But, yeah. And look at the debris he had to go through, as did Reisner. I mean, it's up to like 6 meters in some places. But before we go south with Salim Hassan, these are her titles. So in her door jambs of her chapel here, we have her literally it says King of Upper and Lower Egypt twice, and then Mother of, and then Daughter of the God. Every good thing that she orders is done for her. Khentkawes, that's not Khentkawes, that's kind of Nefertari, but we think she's wearing the vulture headdress that Queen Mothers tended to wear. Now, her title, Mut, Nesut Biti, can either, it's geminated, can either be read Mother of Two Kings or Mother of the King and King herself. And so that's a bit of ambiguity there. Now, we have to keep that in mind because when Salim Hassan excavated south, he came to the front of Menkaure's Valley Temple, which is right here. See, this is the front of the Valley Temple. This pointer's a little bit jerky. And here he's finding a whole nother adjunct to the temple. And this is it over here. So the white is where Reisner excavated and stopped. This is what Salim Hassan excavated. And beside it, there was this huge basin, stepped and terraces. There was an altar or podium. And he hardly shows it, but there's a monumental ramp. All of these are part of the Menkaure Valley Temple, but Salim Hassan called it the Valley Temple of Queen Khentkawes. The MVT proper remained buried under Reisner's backfill, so Hassan saw the anti-temple as a separate temple. Because, everything Reisner did, as stupendous as it was, is just all buried, and he's got this, and he thinks it's a separate temple. The MVT proper remained buried, and so he saw it as a separate temple. I just said that. I think it's most germane to call it an anti-temple because we know it's not the Valley Temple of Khentkawes, although Egyptologists accepted that up until very recent years. This is the Valley Temple of Khentkawes. Anti-temple is most anodyne, and I've been wanting to use that word for 3 weeks. Hassan took it as the Valley Temple of Khentkawes I, writing that her causeway led to it. But her causeway does not lead to it. No, it doesn't lead to it. This is what we had then. We have this is what we're left with. This is the total template. The Khentkawes town, this big L-shaped pattern, the Menkaure Valley Temple, and then what I called the annex, but I think it's best called the anti-temple. And why I moved AERA into the MVT and KKT? Because two complexes seem to be colliding here, even at different orientations. Something seemed off about this, something we friendly Egyptologists were not getting right, it seemed to me. Barry Kemp and Rainer Stadelmann, Barry Kemp is an eminent archaeologist for ancient settlement, Rainer Stadelmann, an authority on the pyramids. They both took the Khentkawes town and MVT as a unitary settlement, the pyramid town of Menkaure. The Italian surveyors Maraggio and Rinaldi had it right. This was the MVT anti-temple. It evolved on the temple front terrace, like the terraces of other valley temples, Khafre's, for example. And there's a very steep drop there, perhaps into a harbor basin or some kind of lower terrace. These two vestibules, as we'll see, were an important clue as to the real meaning of this anti-temple. Here was the interface between the pyramids and the Nile Valley. That's why I moved the AERA team to investigate the Menkaure Valley Temple here in the Khentkawes town. We were interested in, the harbor, the water transport infrastructure. Here was a zone of the living. To understand the ancient Egyptians, we need to know more about their daily lives, not just their tombs, as I've said. And this is where settlement concentrated on the Giza Plateau at the southeast base of the Pyramid Plateau proper. From Area A, the Hatel Garab site, which is our lost city of the pyramids. We also, what's important for the history of the Old Kingdom, we have the transition from major settlement and infrastructure for building pyramids to pyramid towns of priests serving dead royals. Here are Menkaure, and right beside him, the Queen Mother Khentkawes. We work around a growing modern cemetery implanted right in the mouth of the central wadi. So our lost city of the pyramid site, HEG, is over there. We found another site of housing and settlement here, which I'll talk about, and here's the Menkaure Valley Temple. And all of this is part of our re-clearing of the Khentkawes town, which Salim Hassan left exposed, and so we find it much weathered down, but still full of information. So Ancient Egypt Research Associates, we spent 18 months total in the Menkaure Valley Temple, which I've already said, 9 different field seasons, and so we've been in the temple 4 times longer than Reisner, but we dig in a way, we record in a way that Reisner did not, of course. And if Reisner worked the way we did, we wouldn't know half of what we know about the Menkaure Valley Temple. But because we work the way we do, we know a whole lot more in other ways. So it's kind of a trade-off. We've done only 2/3 of the temple. Why does the town turn? Well, and the question of the Khentkawes Causeway, Hassan said the causeway turns and goes to there, so that's her valley temple. But it doesn't, and I said it doesn't. At the end of the Khentkawes Causeway, we actually found a pivot socket for a door. So how did you get up there? And we found the answer to why the town turns. This is the Khentkawes Causeway here, coming from her chapel. And you see only centimeters remain because Salim Hassan didn't backfill. And then it ends here on the east, and there's a big pivot socket there. And we found 3 different phases to the causeway. At one point, it was almost 2 meters wide. But in the middle phase of the causeway, you see the big pivot socket there, and over there's the door jamb against which it turned, the jamb. That was a major entrance, but when it was narrowed for Khentkawes Causeway, it was 1.6 meters wide. Beyond this doorway, we found the true valley complex of Khentkawes 1. We found these lateral ramps, we found terraces, stairs, long corridors going off to the east, and a whole arrangement that in stylized drawing looks something like this around what we think is a harbor basin. This northern corridor especially was long, still 1.6 meters wide. And at the end of that corridor, we came to the silo building complex, a house, just like the large houses of the Khentkawes towns, but with a huge bakery and 5 silos, 5 philes, the 5 za, for storing grain. The ceilings, it's all 5th dynasty. The ceilings range from Menkaure to Niuserre, which was the most frequent. These are the first kings, the first major part of the 5th dynasty, the dynasty that built their pyramids at Abu Sir, that built sun temples. So what I wanted to get to in talking about the Khentkawes Causeway is one, and remember, this is all we're trying to work this out together. One, her causeway does not turn and go to the anti-temple. In fact, it goes like this, and just like Menkaure's causeway juts to the south and then continues east, the 2 causeways were in fact, all of this in the first temple phase we think was planned together as one unitary layout. The true access to the MVT via the anti-temple is this broad ramp, and this is something new. I mean, Salim Hassan hardly described this ramp. He called it a causeway, but it's a huge, broad ramp. And you have up here the water tank 2, this big step basin. Here's the entrance into the anti-temple. This ramp expands from 7 meters up to 12 meters. Unfortunately, it was cut by a flash flood of just the kind that Reisner said destroyed the Menkaure Valley Temple. And so That flash flood cut right through these extramural fieldstone houses and took out one side of the ramp. Otherwise, the ramp is truly monumental. It's totally different than other causeways or, the causeway corridor. Why do you need such a huge, broad, monumental ramp? At the top of the ramp is a podium with its own small ramp and low, thin enclosure wall. The podium is probably an altar. Here's Salim Hassan's only published photo of the podium, and you can see that the podium, an altar probably, with its enclosure wall is standing fairly well extruded. But because he didn't backfill, and before the sand covered it to protect it, from wind and so on, horses and camels and these buggies that tourists were driving right over it. And so we find it today as a kind of convex domed structure. These features are part of the Menkaure Valley Temple. They're not something else. All of this is the Menkaure Valley Temple. The best parallel I can find for this is the Sun Temple of Userkaf. You have Menkaure, he dies. Shepseskaf finishes his temple. The next king is the first king of the 5th dynasty, Userkaf. These early kings of the 5th dynasty were religious fanatics. They were totally fanatic about Ra, the worship of Ra, and in addition to their pyramid complexes, they built these sun temples. Well, Userkaf's sun temple is also built out of mud brick, and he has an extraordinary wide, I think it's 11 meters wide ramp going up to his sun temple, which, like the Menkaure Valley Temple, went through 4 different building phases, 3 or 4. So, in fact, the Menkaure Valley Temple and the Userkaf Temple are being built at the same time, especially what we think is the Middle Temple. Why? Because Shepseskaf, as far as we know, only reigned 4 years. Userkaf comes to the throne, he starts building this Sun Temple. They were built about the same time, and so I'm wondering, is the podium an altar like the altars we have in the Sun Temple of Userkaf? Are these unusually broad causeways for cattle? Because we know from texts that enormous quantities of cattle were being sacrificed and slaughtered, eaten, the meat distributed from the sun temples, especially the Sun Temple of Niuserre. Too detailed to go into, but we know that a lot of cattle, and Egyptologists debate, where were these cattle being slaughtered? Up in the Sun Temple? Apparently they had to get up, the meat had to get up there to be consecrated before it's sent over to the Pyramid Temple. These religious fanatics building these sun temples. It was like Akhenaten. More than 1,200 years later, you have to put everything on these altars for the sun, and then you can go and consume it. Was something similar happening back at the Menkaure Valley Temple? Because basically what we're seeing in the Khentkawes town and the Menkaure Valley Temple is from the time of these religious fanatics, these sun worshippers who are building sun temples. Can we imagine slaughtering up there at the top of the ramp? To forecast a point we AERA are getting to, because I told you about the timing, and so I should forecast my point. Most of what we are seeing in the MVT is a middle temple built in Dynasty 5 by kings who built the sun temples in which they worshiped Ra and Hathor. Are these features solar elements? These features here that they added to the MVT, why did they care so much about Menkaure? And why did they care so much about Queen Khentkawes I? About cattle and meat. We know they were eating meat. I'll go through this really quickly. I said that Reisner was backfilling. When we went into the western part of the temple, we found his backfill, both the clean sand and the silty settlement debris. We took that silty settlement debris and here we go, and we sieved it, because we're very compulsive about these things. He plunged down through he dumped the clean sand, he excavated through the settlement, he dumped the dense silty settlement deposits, and as we re-excavated the southwestern quarter of the temple, we sieved all these deposits. Now, our archaeology is really a pain in the neck, as Vicky Almanza-Villatoro can tell you, because she's in some of these views, filling out these forms for every freaking sample that we take, and we not only sieve, and most good expeditions do, then we take what's left over, this gravel, and we wash all that gravel, and then with the patience of Job, we dry it, and we have people who pick out animal bone, ceilings, these ceilings stamped with kings' names and so on. And what we're finding, we're finding the material culture correlates for those royal decrees. They said, we're establishing these pecher offerings for all these people, and this is the pecher offerings, something that Vicky Almanza-Villatoro picked up on and wrote a very astute article about. We were even finding statue fragments. I just think you should know this, because these are things that Reisner missed, including what seems to be the beard of a dyad, or could be a triad, could be a dyad, I don't know, Florence's department. But findings from the fauna indicate a lot of end bones that they're using for what they call in Arabic kawara, knuckle bone soup, and a preponderance of forelimbs, where they're hacking off the forelimb of a cow, just as we see in the tomb scenes. My question is, when we think about the emplacement and the intention of these beautiful sculptures, how do we square it with the messiness of slaughter and butchering? You know, many Egyptologists have said about the sun temples, which have what look like slaughter halls, slaughter courts, that no, they wouldn't be doing that messy thing within a sun temple. But I actually think that's a Western bias. They probably were not slaughtering inside the temple because the door is too narrow to get in there, but perhaps out at the top of the broad ramp or down by the basin. So those are some thoughts about these elements. And we learn more about the, it's really quite an amazing monumental structure. I think next we go to the northeast hole, as we call it. Reisner never saw it because he stopped his excavation before he got to the actual corner. At some point, somebody took out the actual corner of the temple, and they built what looks like another thieves' hole. And it also has a stony revetment. I actually think this one could be ancient, and I'm wondering if this one and even thieves' hole are wells from the late occupation, the people who were occupying the Menkaure Valley Temple late in its history. You can see here this NEH hole, as we call it, and we give every single element a number because we have compulsion neuroses. You can actually see how monumental was Menkaure's attempt to build this massive stone temple. He wanted to build a temple like Khafre's just to the northeast, which was actually finished and looked something like that. But of course, Menkaure never finished. And now we can understand better, too, why this cannot be the Valley Temple of Khentkawes. If you don't have that terrace in the anti-temple, you come out, this is floor level up here in the Menkaure Valley Temple. If you don't have that terrace there, you just fall down 2 to 3 meters. So the anti-temple is no doubt part of the Menkaure Valley Temple. No cattle are coming through here. The anti-temple doorway is only 1 meter wide. The anti-temple itself saw a long and complicated history, 300 years long. This is the anti-temple as Salim Hassan found it. And you can see in the upper left, that's how we find it. A lot of erosion when you don't backfill. There are those 4 wonderful alabaster column bases, but one of the remarkable things, I think, is that Salim Hassan found the pivot socket for the very doorway into the anti-temple. This is probably late in the history of the site. This is the actual entrance into the MVT. And the pivot socket for the doorway was actually cut right into one of Khafre's feet from one of his statues. Already George Reisner saw a lot of evidence of people breaking up these statues, these royal statues within the court during the even 5th dynasty occupation of the temple. So it's contrary to what we might expect inside a temple with such fabulous sculptures. The latest floor was flush with the tops of 4 alabaster column bases. One other thing we found that is tying this anti-temple with these beautiful column bases, and we found several different floor levels that we were dissecting. One thing that ties this that was not noticed before to the Menkaure Valley Temple is this vestibule with these beautiful column bases. It's repeated in room 377 in the vestibule at the front of the Menkaure Valley Temple itself. So you see you have there and you have there. They're identical. Who did them? Who put in these beautiful column bases? Well, in our sondages in the floor of the anti-temple, we actually found 3 different floors. There's the floor of the first temple, there's a higher floor of the second temple, and then there's the latest floor, which was the one flush with the column bases. And my team members tell me we found a ceiling of Neuserae between floors 1 and 2. It's not a lot to go on, but it's something. A lot of what we're seeing was redone in the 5th dynasty, even a lot of it by Neuserae. This is what we're thinking. We see where Reisner saw a first temple and a second temple, we see 3. Menkaure's unfinished stone temple, MVT 0, the first temple of Shepseskaf, MVT 1, the middle temple, sorry for the typo, of Neuserae, MVT 2, and the third temple, possibly of Pepi. So nowhere do we see this sequence as clearly as in sondage 144 at the back wall right behind the central offering hall. Here's how Reisner left. This is how Reisner left this sondage 144. Sondage 144 is right here. First of all, he left a box full of alabaster fragments and so on, and we found some of those alabaster fragments. Florence Friedman was taking a look at them and analyzing them in the lab, including statue fragments, on this big mound of debris right behind the offering hall. This is where we're started to excavate. We're right behind the offering hall, which Reisner says was wiped out by a flash flood that brought an end to the 5th dynasty temple, brought an end to the first temple, and then it was abandoned for many years before people came back and built the second temple. So this is our excavation proceeding. Reisner saw this pit, but he never excavated back here except for the causeway corridor. And he only excavated smack within the causeway corridor. He actually didn't excavate the walls. This is our excavation at the end of 2021. It was very clear. We have this water wall, which Reisner says was built at the end of the temple occupation by the 6th dynasty people against flash flooding, the kind of flash flooding that broke through the west wall of the temple, washed through the sanctuary, and he says wiped the temple out and people abandoned it. Here's the major flood event right here that he was seeing inside the temple. So we excavated behind this to understand the stratigraphy and to see this event as it came up against the back wall of the temple, which he didn't see. So we came down on this middle temple floor. So here's what Reisner called the second temple with its water wall, 6th dynasty. Here's our middle temple, and we came down onto this floor, middle temple. Where's the first temple? In the third temple times, the causeway had collapsed. The floor was the debris surface. So they're building the water wall on that debris surface. And as a glacis against further flash flooding. Now, this year, in 2024, we continued down. So that floor you were seeing was at this level right here. And we did this deep probe. And we knew the lower floor was down there. So, for example, there's the deep probe. And now, in 2024, we came to the bottom of the deep probe, and there's another floor. We're actually just peeling it away, and we're finding the gravelly bedding for that floor. And here's the causeway, which was actually vaulted. And we can actually see distinctions in the plaster between a first temple and a middle temple, and then you have a third temple. So it's pretty clear here at the back of the temple. And at the bottom of all of it, we came down to the foundation blocks, the big limestone blocks that Menkaure's builders were setting into place for what we call Temple 0. This is a profile through 301 years of environmental change. As for a major flood event that Reisner saw in the offering hall, we would have to go into the offering hall, and we can. But I told you that I didn't know about the timing of this talk. We're putting all this together ourselves. We're actually putting all these seasons' work together and trying to come to a comprehensive understanding, which we really don't yet have, but I'm kind of shaping it as I'm talking to you and putting this talk together. So I could go another 5 minutes, but it's a little late, and this is a good time. We could end it here. or we could go into the offering hall and see what Reisner saw. Peter, what do you say?
2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll take some questions.
All right, very quick. If you think it's complicated, it's really complicated inside the offering hall. This is where Reisner saw the major flood event. That's the offering hall in the time of what we call the third temple, what he called the second temple. That's the floor of the offering hall. Very nice. You have a nice floor, you have nice walls. Those are things he found on the floor of the offering hall. His second temple, our third temple. And I know you'll want to cut it. It's not complicated so far, but then it gets really complicated because Reisner cut back the west wall. He cut down through the floor, and this is something Reisner would do. He would gouge along the base of the walls. He would put big trenches into walls to try to get the phasing. Because remember, nobody else ever saw the temple altogether. This is his photo after he had done all his excavations. He's gone through the floor of his second temple, or third temple. He's gone down. He's gouged into the wall. Here he's cut out a wall. Let's go to our, and we found it pretty much like he left it. Here he's gouged into the wall. He's gouged into the wall. And we actually see evidence. Again, here's Reisner's second temple. It's our third because here's his first temple, but we see an older first temple. So basically we have first temple, middle temple, third temple, and then this wall here that he cut into, this was actually between the middle temple and the third temple. So it's really complicated. And the face of the, you can actually see how the whole offering hall was exposed and the bricks got very crackly and gnarly. You can see the sand that was left fluvial from running water. And this is Dan Jones looking at the big cut. All of this is like debris. It's like a big polyp where the debris came down into the offering hall. And his second temple, our third temple, people built the wall right over the, yeah, I know. So I'll tell you what. What happened to the first temple? If everything we're seeing is middle temple, real quick, the short answer is we don't know. This is what we're pretty sure is first temple. The blue, the green is Reisner's plan. This is what we think is Middle Temple, the blue. You can see that a lot of it's been rebuilt. And Middle Temple for us is 5th Dynasty, these Sun Temple building kings. That's Temple 0, and this is the 3rd Temple, MVT3. I just want to end with this, Peter, if I may, just have 3 more minutes, because I think you guys will like this. And all that complicated stuff will not be on the exam, because it's just too complicated. But when Reisner, and I'm going to not read the text, when Reisner backfilled Thieves' Hole right here, he put retaining walls around it, because he said there's still statues down there. There are more. So like, AERA doesn't like to find nice things. We get really kind of, pissed off when we do because it's, a lot of guards and, no, we like nice things too. So we went back to take another look at Thieves' Hole. And we actually excavated Thieves' Hole, which is now, Thieves' Hole and Dyad Hole are one big hole now because Reisner took out the revetment and so on. And here we are documenting Thieves' Hole and the Dyad Hole. And, we were asking, we knew where we were because of the core block with its tethering hole and so on. And we arrived at that exact position. We were wondering, though, it's all this dark silty material. Is it damp sand or is it silt? Was there some kind of mud brick installation that disintegrated around this standing statue? And we wondered, look at these markers in the core blocks, and that's where the dyad was. And it's not really correct. That's where the dyad was found, over there. And in fact, it's almost, boom, on the temple axis. Again, did somebody put it there on purpose? Well, Did Shepseskaf put it there when he built the first temple deep into the foundations? Why did we find that silty surface? We found it too. It definitely was silt. Was something built there? Probably not. Okay, probably, oops, I'm sorry, I'm doing it again. It looks like somebody cut the dyad hole. So the thieves' hole was there. The dyad hole in the ruins after the Middle Temple was destroyed by that flash flood. Nonetheless, we went back, and we have these amazingly dedicated workers who, Reisner was stopped by the water table, we were stopped by the water table. But, you know, we had Syed Gamal Fauzi and Sufi Abu Talib and Zika Abbas and other really dedicated workers, and they were so keen to keep digging and digging as much as they could. We're going to end now on this. Old Kingdom pottery was turning up. We had Wally and Florence ready to get on an airplane. Pieces of exotic stone were turning up. It's almost like cenote archaeology in the Mayan. You know, the Mayans have these big, cenotes, these water, and these guys are really doing underwater archaeology out there in the middle of the frigging Giza desert. They were saying, this is Syed Gamal Fauzi, he's got this big long thing, it's smooth, and they were trying their best to lift it up and get it out of there. We thought we had a statue. Really, we were all really sure. We're all filming, and 5 men tried to get under the object to lift it. It would not budge. Now they truly went in for underwater archaeology. I mean, they were like under there for like 2-3 minutes, and they're strapping young guys. I mean, let's say Gamal Fauzi, trying his best to bring whatever up he could, and they brought stuff up, hammerstones, and tantalizingly, fragments, worked fragments of statues, statue fragments. There's one with pleating of a headdress or a kilt. And then, curiously, pottery of the late Roman period. However, that doesn't put us off, because Thieves' Hole and Dyad Hole, the way they were just like digging around in Reisner's time, Reisner recognized stratigraphy, and he was a pioneer in that field, as Peter has outlined in Walking Among Pharaohs. But he didn't dig stratigraphically. Nobody did. And so all of this debris from Thieves' Hole, from the older Dyad Hole, it all just gets mixed. And I have a theory that I'll just keep another half hour to tell you. No, I'm kidding. The Thieves' Hole and that big hole in the northeast corner are actually wells during the late occupation of the temple. And maybe not so late as Roman, but we do have many, many, many late Roman burials, including up into in Menkaure's upper temple. So I'm not so worried about that, because I think there's ample possibility for contamination there. Yeah, possibly that late. So this is one weird hole. We are much deeper than bedrock in the Northwest Magazines, and still we have not seen the bottom of the foundation core blocks. And this brings up the final question. Look how much stone was quarried. This is Khentkawes, her bedrock pedestal, 10 meters, 30 feet. And the Menkaure Valley Temple is lying yet even lower. This is a profile of the back of the temple. We have bedrock, and then nothing. And Dyad Hole is the deepest we have got under the Menkaure Valley Temple, and we're still not at the bottom of it. So the question is, Menkaure's motivations. Why did he put his valley temple in a deep quarry hole, for God's sake? Well, for these reasons, perhaps. He wanted to be on this great Giza diagonal, so he had to situate his pyramid there. He wanted a straight causeway axis. He needed to get as close as possible to the farthest reach of the Nile water. Okay. And this place had already been deeply quarried. So he just had to put it there. But maybe there was another motivation. Maybe he had a faunic reason. That's the other word I've been wanting to use for, and actually it's very academic, but that's, appropriate here. It's a very pedantic word. Maybe, and then I'll let you go, he just wanted to be near his mom. Thank you. It's complicated. I knew it was going to be hard. All right, thanks. You've been great.